Well, welcome back and welcome to those who are joining us for this session. We're very grateful to the entire team, for President Biden's for affording us so much time for this important effort. We've had a very productive day with the Democratic managers and a fascinating session on the convention. So we're looking forward to this general election session. We're fortunate to have Toluse and Margaret moderate it. Margaret is sporting her IOP shirt as a former resident fellow. Simone, take note of that. So we want to get into this part and allow a fulsome conversation, and then as is our custom, allow for a couple of student questions at the close. So Jello and Margaret, I'll turn it over to you with my gratitude for all the effort and preparation that you went through.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you for such a big and illustrious group spending so much time on a weekend with everything going on, joining us to help us create this first draft of history. That's really what we want to do, is have essentially a book that people can look back on 10, 20, 30 years from now and say, this is what it was like inside these campaigns. This is how the 2020 election went. So we appreciate your presence, and obviously we appreciate your candor as we ask a number of different questions. Margaret and I are going to try to speed through as much as we can. We did listen to the earlier session of the primaries, so we're going to try to pick it up after the primaries. We may end up going back and forth a little bit across the timeline because so much happened, especially in those final months. But we will try to specifically ask questions to specific people, but we also want this to be a free-flowing discussion, so feel free to jump in as you want. We're going to try to speed through as many questions as we can, so if you could keep your answers as concise and tight as possible, we would appreciate that. And one other thing that I would note is that we are obviously hoping that the Trump campaign will also participate in this. So we will be asking some questions to you that we'll ask very similar or even exact same questions to the Trump folks. So if you hear some of our questions, just know that some of them may be asked to the competing campaign as well, and some of that will work its way into the book. So with that, I just want to say thank you again, and I'll kick it over to Margaret for the first question.
Great. Hi, everyone. And I echo Toluse's thanks to Mark and the team for having us, and all of you for putting up with us for the next hour and a half. Where we really want to start is somewhere like in that last week of August, first week of September, which is officially the general election. And where in a normal year we would end is sometime between November 7th and December 14th. But let's fudge the dates a little bit. An earlier panel ran out of time before asking a question that I know everybody will want to memorialize the answer to. And for that date peg, let's look at August 11th. That's the date that Joe Biden formally selects Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate. Can you guys take us inside the decision process briefly that led up to that announcement on August 11th? Was there ever any doubt that it would be now Vice President Harris? Who were the two or three closest contenders, and what really made the difference, whether it was from a getting elected perspective or a sort of whatever Chemistry America perspective?
Anita, you want to take that?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And so Margaret, the Vice President Biden during the primary campaign said that he actually in the last primary debate against Senator Sanders pledged to select a woman as his vice presidential nominee. He had throughout the campaign said he thought it should be a woman, and that he felt that that there were many qualified women. And indeed, when we began this vice presidential process, there were a huge number of qualified women. So I think it's important to say that he had a very open mind, that there were, I think at the beginning of this process, somewhere around 17 or 18 women, elected officials, a few non-elected officials, federal officials, state officials, but extraordinarily qualified people who he had an initial cut done on in terms of a public records vet. He also asked for very interesting people to serve as co-chairs of the process. And they spent a lot of time talking both with the people on the list as well as people generally throughout the political party. It was Mayor Eric Garcetti, former Senator Chris Dodd, Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, who was also co-chair of the campaign, as was Garcetti, and Cynthia Hogan, who had been a very close aide of the vice president's for a number of years when he was in the United States Senate and serving as vice president. So it was a comprehensive process. There were some women who chose not to go forward in the process for various reasons. But I would say that at the end of the day, it boiled down to 11 people. And there was really never any short list of 2 or 3 people that he made the decision based very much the same way Barack Obama made his decision to pick Joe Biden on a series of data points that ranged from whether he felt this person would be ready to be president should something happen. That is always the first qualification, to sort of how they viewed the world, how they viewed the challenges ahead of them, to just personal chemistry. So it was a choice that came at the end of a very comprehensive process.
I know we have a lot of other ground to cover, but 2 kind of tidbits I want to pick up on before I kick this back to Tolu, and appreciate anyone else who would also want to weigh in. There was at least the thought at the time that Ambassador Rice was another finalist. I mean, you said there's not 2 or 3, maybe she was one of 11, but was the whole like Benghazi distraction, the idea that you knew that's what Republicans would do with the final weeks of the campaign. Did that end up being a disqualifying component, whether fair or not? And how important did the year of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter become in making the decision that there should be not just a woman, but a woman of color?
So I think Cedric, Mike should also weigh in here. I will tell you that we have not discussed specific candidates, and I'm not going to do it now, Margaret. That was a confidential process in which we told people that it was going to be confidential, and it was. I think that at the end of the day, the choice that the vice president made was one based on his own experience as having been Barack Obama's vice president and having, as he said, a better sense than anybody in the United States of what the job really entailed. And so, Mike, Cedric, I don't know if there's something you want to add to that.
No, I would just agree. I think he picked the person he thought was best. I don't think it had anything to do with skin color or anything else. I think that then Senator Harris was the best that fit all of his criteria, and that's who he wanted, and that's who he went with. And she was a phenomenal running mate, and she's a good VP. So, no, I unless Simone or somebody else has an other idea, I don't think race played a factor in it.
Can I just say something positive that I don't think we get enough credit for in the age of leaks? It did not leak. We fully expected, Anita kept telling us it might leak, and we will just be prepared. And it did not leak. And I will just say, I think that's credit to the process that the 4 co-chairs, Anita, Jen, and others ran, and the now President Biden, then candidate Biden ran. So no leaks, and it was a great rollout.
How many people knew who didn't leak? What was the full size of the knowledge circle?
It was pretty tightly kept, but I think a few hours or the night before we started having some conversations with a broader internal group. But we did it, to Simone's point, we did it our way, in a way that really made sure that everyone felt good about it. There were, by the end and in the hours leading up to the actual announcement, there were a lot of people that were finding out because we were making calls and the president was making calls. But I'm glad you brought that up, Simone, because that's, crowning achievement for staff operatives to have that work the way it did.
I do want to pick up where Margaret left off on the question of race, in part because it was a big factor in this campaign. Obviously, the former vice president, now the president, said he got into this race in part because of what happened at Charlottesville. We saw former President Trump, stoking racial divisions throughout the course of his presidency. you had, continuing with this timeline, August 23rd, you had the shooting of Jacob Blake by police in Wisconsin, following a summer of unrest following the George Floyd killing. If you can take us into that moment, early August, the summer had really been very, it had really erupted with protests and unrest in some cities, and the former president had been leaning into this law and order message, and obviously there are racial undertones there. We know that the selection of Kamala Harris, the senator, to become the vice presidential nominee was important for a lot of the constituencies that Joe Biden wanted to excite. Can you talk about what it was like in late August with the shooting of Jacob Blake and the then candidate Biden going to Kenosha following former President Trump's visit there? Can you give us a sense of how you were looking at the issue of race, the issue of police violence, the issue of Black Lives Matter as you entered the general election, where Joe Biden was not only trying to get a lot of voters of color out, but also trying to rebuild the blue wall and win back a lot of the white working class voters that he said that he would not leave behind when he started campaigning?
Simone, if you want to take that, you can. I would just say that he's always been guided by his values. And when he saw stuff that's wrong, he calls it out. And just so happens we had a real summer with real issues where unarmed African-American people were being killed by police. And he did it in a way to acknowledge that there was a problem and that as a country, if we came together, we could fix it. And we didn't buy into Trump's law and order and division. And the truth is, you can cry law and order when you're the opponent, but not when you're the incumbent. When you're an incumbent, you can't cry law and order because it's your responsibility. So, Simone, you may have more to add there.
Look, I think what then candidate Biden did when he went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, was very important. He was visibly demonstrating how he would govern if the American people elected him as president, someone who would be a consensus builder, who would bring people together, Jacob Blake's family, community members, law enforcement, the faith community, and bring people to the table to have a conversation and then chart a pathway forward. And I would just underscore what Congressman Richmond said. This is indicative of how candidate Biden carried himself throughout the course of this election cycle. He didn't allow the outside noise really to affect his bottom line and his message. And I would also argue that he was a voice for that the American people needed to hear, that they were not hearing from their president. No one expected Donald Trump to be able to come in and be a calming figure and a calming voice. He was too chaotic. He had already demonstrated he was unable to rise to that occasion. But time and time again, then candidate Biden did. And I think that was important for the American people. I'll say one other thing, and then I think, I defer to my colleagues, but the speech that then candidate Biden gave in the suburb in Pittsburgh, particularly about law and order, was, I thought, very important, countering President Trump's message, saying, and I defer to, the message guru here that is on the line, Anita Dunn, but truly, calling it what it was, Donald Trump was trying to scare people. He was trying to scare folks in the suburbs, scare the American people, and Joe Biden went out there and spoke truth to power and really laid out what was really happening and what Trump was trying to do.
And if I could direct that to Anita or any of the other strategists on the call about sort of whether there was ever a concern within the campaign that the law and order message from Trump, which we have seen in the past that law and order, has been successful for some previous candidates, and it does have appeal with a large slice of the American public. Whether there was a point within the campaign where there was concern that that message was going to break through, and the need for candidate Biden to speak out and counter that message to keep it from seeping through and breaking through with the public.
Well, and I think Mike can speak to this as well, but these are issues that Joe Biden has dealt with throughout his entire career. And his view, as he publicly said, was that wanting to have better policing to address the abuses is not inconsistent with wanting to have good law and order. As a matter of fact, as he often said on the campaign trail, there is nobody who gets more upset about bad policemen than good policemen. So he felt strongly, and Jen referenced this in the morning session, but it is worth repeating, that throughout this general election, what Vice President Biden did was basically model for the American people what a president should do. And at times of unrest, a president should go out and he should be honest. He should lay the issues out honestly for the American people. He should address them and he should lead. And on this issue, as on others, that was what Vice President Biden wanted to do. And these were issues he knew extremely well from his entire career in the United States Senate.
I would say that there was never any doubt about where President Biden was going to be. He announced for president because of what happened in Charlottesville, and he made it very clear. I would point you to the speech. It wasn't much noticed, but he gave a speech to the National Baptist Conference in Arlington, Texas, around January, I believe. The very forceful statement about what was happening relative to race, racial justice, what was happening in the country, and it was an important speech he gave. He really spoke to sort of a, he referenced Bull Connor. He also referenced that it's often been in our darkest moments that we've made the greatest progress. But it was an important speech. It wasn't given much notice, but it was an important speech. It was an important speech in the primary as well as the general election. He then, if you remember at the convention, he opened his speech representing a civil rights icon. In June, he gave a speech on George Floyd, where he opened with the final words that George Floyd spoke. And the essence of that speech was what kind of country we're going to be. He forcefully went at Trump in all these speeches. Speech that Simone's representing Pittsburgh was an important moment in the race where he refused to accept the view that you couldn't be both for public safety and for civil rights. And he forcefully fought back on that. And that was an important point in the race because it prevented happening to Joe Biden what happened to a lot of folks across the country. And then I would point you to Gettysburg. In the Gettysburg speech, that speech it opens on the line that says, I've come here to talk about the cost of division. What division has cost our country in the past, what's costing us now, or what it could prevent us from achieving in the future. And in that speech, he actually quotes Doc Rivers, who had a very famous quote in the middle of the election, where he spoke about really how extraordinary it was for Black men to keep loving their country, given what they've been through. And so he had a consistent, forceful point of view on this. And it went to the heart of the campaign, because he did believe that we were in battle for the soul of the nation, who we are, what we believe, what we stand for. And that this became one of the most powerful demonstrations of that. And you're right that there were a lot of people who doubted whether it was a smart political move not to buy into the law and order argument, which historically has had some appeal and has politically paid off for folks in the past. And he didn't believe it. And he was forceful and consistent. And I think at a few moments in the race where people weren't sure politically whether it was, quote, the smart thing for him to do, he waded in full force. And I think you can go through, there's probably half a dozen other speeches I could reference, but those are ones that come to mind right now that went right at this line of attack that had been put forward by Trump.
Thanks, Mike. I think we'd like to bounce around a little bit here and skip to strategy. And Jen and Bruce, I'd love to bring you both into the conversation. Bob, I think as well. You'll see why in a second. Some people called it the red mirage. You can call it whatever you want to. At some point, there became a theory that the way the votes were going to come in on election night could be an issue in terms of public perception and keeping the peace and this kind of stuff. And also at some point early in the general election season, then President Trump began messaging the notion, sort of test messaging the notion that if he wasn't immediately declared the winner, he would contest or dispute those results. Could you bring us inside those discussions about how you thought about the red mirage, or whatever term you want to use it, and about at that early stage in the general election, how seriously you took the notion that that Trump might not concede even if he lost?
I'll start and then you guys should jump in. I mean, look, I think one of the secrets to the success of President Biden, we've been talking about all day, which is the discipline of the message and the vision, and also the discipline of the campaign, in particular in the general election and certainly in the primary, that, you know, we had to ensure, no matter what crazy stuff Trump was doing at any point, that we were able to pinpoint what was really important and mattered, and what was just noise that, if we took the bait, would take us off our game or distract us from the work that we had. And I think we had a really good radar on that. And I think that was really important. When it comes to talking about voting, it's really important that you never have a conversation that makes a voter believe that it is too hard to participate or that their vote would not somehow count. And so we had to work very hard to really drive our strategy, which I think was incredibly thorough and proactive, and frankly has never been done before. And Bob and I talked often about how many voter protection campaigns we've been part of, and this was at orders of magnitude, that we had to take seriously what was happening, but we couldn't actually change both our strategy and also allow that to become the driving narrative. But we had an opportunity from very early on to communicate about what was going to happen on Election Day in a way that we wouldn't typically do. Talking about, and this kind of goes into everything about the race being closer than, a lot of the public polling was. And we really felt like we had to drive that ourselves, because, we got to a point where people were thinking that, we were going to just run away with it and we were totally fine. And we knew that was not the case. It was going to be much tighter. But we also knew that the order of the way the votes will come in and the way that the Trump drive to determine timing for counting for early voting meant that some of our core states, the blue wall states, were going to be coming in much, much later. And so we definitely had swing states that would be coming in earlier. We knew election night would be long. And so we were very well prepared to both think about how we communicate that to our activists and the folks that are paying attention, how we brought calm across the board to ensure that voters knew that they had the information to go do what they had to go do, but they were not going to be prevented from being the determinant of who wins here. And we said that over and over again, the American people are going to decide who wins on election, and they did. But I think that we really kind of, again, to this theme, we had to be very disciplined, but we also had to be the voice of reason and the clear comfort, as there was a lot of swirl out there that the American people are going to decide that we were prepared for every single scenario. Every vote was going to be counted and Joe Biden was going to win.
And credit to Jen for all of that, as well as for the fact that first of all, we had to win. And Joe Biden was incredibly focused on that from the day he got into the race. So he gave his first speech in Pittsburgh. He gave his first speech after the convention in Pittsburgh. He wanted to win Pennsylvania more than anything else, if not just because it would put him over the top, but because he felt that the voters in Pennsylvania kind of represented where we had failed as a party, and what was up for grabs. And let's not forget how much he expanded the map. And Jen and others went out on a limb early on, saying you can win in Arizona. He won Arizona, only candidate besides Clinton to win Arizona since 1948. First Northern Democrat to win in Georgia since John Kennedy. So it was a matter of rebuilding the blue wall and actually motivating and persuading that whole coalition that had flocked to him in the primaries, but we had to broaden it in the general, and it was it was a remarkable thing to go to give that speech down in Warm Springs in the heart of Trump country, and it took a lot of guts for the campaign to take that chance, but he was conscious throughout the campaign that if he was going to win, he was going to be what he has said many times since, a president for every American, whether they voted for him or not.
I know everybody is invested in the idea of unity and showing how together everyone was, but there are always internal debates inside of campaigns about we could go to Georgia, or we could go to Arizona, or we could skip them and focus on whatever. So now that everyone's together on this call, does anyone want to own up to making the wrong call and being glad that you got overridden or anything like that? No. Okay. If you want to do it, we're into it. Bob, before I kick it back to Tolu, how early did your strategizing on two fronts, both the early voting stuff and what you were going to do if the sitting president lost and wouldn't go? How can you talk to us a little bit about that? And at what point did you guys realize that COVID and the voting difficulties that it had posed in those early months and those early primaries, that you guys could actually turn that into an opportunity to lean into it, to expand voting opportunities? Like, who figured that out?
I think you're muted, Bob.
Let me first, by the way, just answer the question you originally asked about when it became clear that Trump might not concede the election. He, after all, in 2016 said that the popular vote victory that Clinton won was a mirage and that it was accounted for entirely by illegal voting. He set up this Pence-Kobach commission early in his administration to investigate the fact, as he saw it, of fraud in the United States. That commission completely imploded, but he did set up a commission headed by his own vice president, dedicated to proving that there was massive fraud in the United States, all of it directed essentially against Republicans, certainly against him. And he had more than a few occasions to do what he did in 2016, which was to say, I'm not going to commit again to conceding, and to make it very clear that he thought that any apparent loss on his part was probably the product of fraud. So there was never any question in my mind, and I think I'm speaking for everybody, that if Donald Trump lost the election, he'd find a reason to say that he didn't. And those reasons, by the way, were the ones he's always put out, and that is widespread fraud. Second, on the question of the pandemic opportunity, I would also, let me begin by saying there was an enormous threat here. And that is what we were very focused on at the very outset. Jen, Dana Remus, our general counsel, the entire team were very, very concerned about what we saw in the primaries. You had essentially an electoral process, which is always fragile. The infrastructure for the conduct of elections in the United States is very weakly supported. And all of a sudden it came under breaking pressure. So you saw what happened, for example, in Milwaukee or in Georgia, where for all practical purposes, the elections collapsed. And to the extent that they were going to collapse in big cities where we stood to do very well. So the first order of business in thinking about the pandemic was not the expansion of opportunity, but the averting disaster. And so we devoted, and I think Jen is correct, we've done this many times over many cycles, an absolutely extraordinary sort of Marshall Plan level effort to focus resources on helping election officials actually conduct an election. That was the first order of business. Joe Biden couldn't win an election unless there was an election, a plausible election actually held. So I want to stress that because I think it was probably the foundation of the successful effort that we ran. Now, a lot of it had to do with the resources that we committed that were extraordinary and how early we deployed them. There was no question that we needed to have a strong voter protection effort. And these voter protection efforts are part of a robust and very effective field program. But I just want to stress threat as much as opportunity. The second point I would make is there's a tendency to imagine, and this is very popular with the Republicans, that we had an enormous amount to do with opening up sort of all sorts of special opportunities for voter access because of the pandemic. And it is certainly true that wherever possible, we aggressively, energetically supported efforts to take burdens off of voters who were faced with pandemic conditions. And clearly we're going to wind up really struggling, to know that polling places were safe and election officials had the supplies they needed to enable people to vote. But it's also true that a lot of this effort that was made to make it possible for people to vote was the product of a collaboration with election officials who were very anxious to get this done. It wasn't so much that we conducted some massive, clever political operation to expand voting opportunities. We worked with election officials to just recognize the pandemic required it. And in many respects, a lot of the efforts to push those voting opportunities even wider before November 3rd faltered. There were certain things that some of these lawsuits thought that we didn't get, and there were certain things that some of these lawsuits and negotiations with election officials did get. But I don't want to overstate that or overstate the campaign's role. I think the campaign's fundamental success was in helping build up the infrastructure for a successful election and having voting protection personnel on the ground who really facilitated both the work of election officials and the education that voters needed to navigate that particular territory.
Thank you. I want to stick on this topic of electoral strategy to an extent. Someone mentioned the importance of the coalition that Biden brought together. Obviously, it was a very large and diverse coalition, and I think your campaign telegraphed that. It was no surprise that you were going to try to build a coalition that included white working class voters, included a surge in African-American voters, younger voters, Hispanic voters, and you made it very clear. And in part because you made it very clear, I think the Trump campaign also was looking to eat into some of those voting groups. You heard the message about socialism really driven hard, specifically in Hispanic communities in places like Southern Florida, with the Cuban American voters. You heard, we talked about the law and order message and other messages that were tailored specifically at white working class voters. And you even saw the Trump campaign going after African American men specifically, talking about criminal justice reform, talking about then Senator Biden's record with the crime bill and other matters. And I wonder, I'll throw this out to the broad group. I would like to hear Julie talk about, to the extent that you could talk about the Hispanic vote and what we saw in Arizona versus Florida, but how you looked at these various coalitions that you wanted to bring together and how your campaign dealt with the fact that the Trump campaign was also going after a lot of these voters in some ways that were, if you put aside the president's rhetoric, his campaign was actually going into some of these communities, putting together, messages on African-American radio and actually running a campaign to win over some of these voters. So I wonder what you thought as a campaign about that approach and how you tried to counter it.
Great. Well, I can start on the Latino vote. I think one thing in particular is that there was a strong, connection for Latino voters to who Joe Biden was and his core values. And so, I'd say we were very aggressive in terms of making sure that Latino voters knew who he was, what he stood for. I think his core, values, and also the fact that it was rooted in his tradition of faith, in service to others, and public service, really did resonate well with the community. But in areas, as you mentioned, like South Florida, we were up against an extremely intense and a very early disinformation campaign that was very targeted at Cuban voters, Venezuelan voters, and other voters. And so, we really focused our energy and efforts in reaching those voters that we knew we could really connect with up and down the I-4 corridor, throughout Orlando and the Kissimmee area, really speaking to, in particular, Puerto Rican voters who I think had some really devastating and personal experiences with the last administration when it came to response to, Hurricane Maria and other things. In Arizona, we saw a tremendous opportunity to really, be able to tap into, again, some of those core connections to Catholic voters who really saw that connection with Joe Biden. And we didn't see as much of as intense of a disinformation campaign that was happening there. And so really being able to just, really engage and connect with the community. And we did a micro-targeted approach. We didn't treat Latinos in Arizona the same that we communicated with Latinos in South Florida. We knew that they were very different communities with very different priorities and experiences. And so really finding ways of micro-targeting both our message as well as our messengers, and making sure we weren't just communicating in Spanish, but doing so in the right dialect with the right messengers, and really, in the right ways to really target and to engage the communities. And we saw tremendous turnout. I know, what we saw in Arizona and places like Georgia as well, 60% turnout from Latino voters. So we know that they were a critical part of that broader coalition to be able to bring home a win for Joe Biden in the general.
And I just add, the president was very uniquely positioned to build this coalition, right? I think we talk about politics and campaigns, well, how much is, turnout targets versus persuasion targets? And, obviously there's a lot of, thinking about the voters and the electorate. But the reality is it's a false choice to believe you can only do one thing, or that you could win an election at a presidential level against Donald Trump by just turning out people or just trying to persuade a small segment. So we really came into this from a standpoint that we can't take anything for granted. We actually have to go make our case. We're in an incredibly unique situation because of COVID, that we aren't able to reach people in all the same ways we did. And their challenges to even get to vote might be harder, but we have to make the case for that connection. And Joe Biden, you saw it with how he came out of the primary, how quickly he consolidated support, that he was carrying, 94+% of the Democratic Party, higher than any other nominee of support from the party, because he could build across these lines. And I think that gave us opportunity to really build this coalition, which we needed to do to hit 81 million people voting. But I would add, and I just reinforced to Julie's point, I think often when we talk about these groups, we talk about them in monoliths, and we say, okay, well, Arizona, here's the strategy and it's Latinos, and here's how we think about white working class in Pennsylvania. Obviously, that's not as simple. And as we thought about places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, our Latino strategy was as aggressive as any campaign has ever had to reach communities and coalitions that you don't typically communicate to. And we did it in a way that allowed us to build it from the communities. And I think that's something we're all incredibly proud of. Yes, you can talk about the resources we spent. You could talk about, how we were surrounding people, not just on advertising, but programming. But it was really the quality of it because it was built from the communities we're reaching, and it was very customized. And I think when you have a tight race, those are the elements, the votes that matter at the end of the day, and customizing the engagement and spending time with these communities, even during COVID, I think, pay dividends in these key places that we had to win.
I've got a bunch of other questions about this, but we've got so many other things to talk about. So I do think we'll move on. If we can jump back into the timeline quickly, to take your minds back to the fall of 2020, September 18th, Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. It's a shock wave for the country, and obviously a shock wave for the presidential campaign. Could you take us a little bit into the room? Obviously that happened, there was a lot that happened very quickly after that. The former president nominated Amy Coney Barrett to replace her. The Republicans in the Senate all seemed to line up behind the idea of having a quick nomination before the election. And there was this period where then Vice President, or then candidate Biden, was asked a lot about whether he would pack the courts, and it really became a thing for a couple of weeks as he sort of tried to figure out the best answer to that question. I wonder if you could take us into that moment in your campaign, how the death of Justice Ginsburg impacted you in the campaign, and how you saw answering some of the questions about what the Democrats and what the leader of the Democratic Party should do next in response to how the Republicans muscled through their nominee. And anyone can take that one.
Kate, do you want to jump in on this?
Sure. I think for voters across the board, and I think the way we sort of viewed this moment was, it really, I think it catalyzed for people the stakes of the election. For I think generally speaking, as you kind of alluded to in your question, for Republicans, it's sort of traditionally thought of as the courts being a kind of motivating issue for Republicans in a way it's not for Democrats. But I think this moment coming, 2 months before Election Day, really catalyzed for voters, for our base, but for independents who had witnessed the kind of chaos and turmoil of the Trump years, and had also seen Trump make a concerted effort to put conservative judges on the lower courts, and of course the Supreme Court as well. I think it was actually quite motivating. And so, as we thought about what the now president, the then vice president, should say and do, I think it was. We viewed it as another opportunity for him to step into a presidential leadership role, rather than sort of driving a hyper partisan message. It was actually a moment to use this anxiety that had been sort of built up in folks, to look at Vice President Biden, now President Biden, as a steady hand, as a leader, as somebody who could be trusted. And I think we sort of resisted what maybe some would have advised, which is a very kind of hyper partisan, motivate your base approach to this moment. And I think we actually chose to kind of lean into his sort of statesman-like leadership, and I think that in and of itself was motivating for independent voters, and as I say, for voters across the spectrum. So I think the way that that the president wanted to navigate that moment was informed by his years of experience, his time in the Judiciary Committee. I mean, the courts are something that he takes very seriously and views not through a hyper partisan lens. And I think following his lead and sort of using this as a leadership moment rather than a hyper partisan moment was actually was beneficial to us.
Thank you. And hi, Steve, welcome back. I'm going to draw you in here. We'll move ahead maybe 11 days or so on the calendar to September 29th. Chris Wallace of Fox News moderates the first presidential debate at Case Western Reserve and with the Cleveland Clinic. And then guess what? Donald Trump announces 3 days later he has COVID. So I'm wondering, starting with you, Steve, if you can take us into that moment where everyone on the campaign realizes, holy crap, President Trump has COVID, and your assessment of one, whether Joe Biden is now in any kind of physical peril or vulnerability. Two, is it a pivot point in the election? What does this mean? What just happened? And can I tuck in a third question? Do you guys think Trump already had it when he walked on the debate stage? Who thinks that? Well, what, Congressman Richmond, seems like would you share with us what you were thinking?
I wasn't worried about it when Trump got COVID. I was worried about it when I got COVID and I was close to the president. I think that's when, that was probably more of a moment than when Trump had it.
Does anyone here now, at this moment, as we are talking, believe that then President Trump had COVID when he walked on that stage of the debate?
No, Margaret, we don't know. Okay, there obviously there was reporting in the Post this week off of the book that's coming out at the end of this month that would suggest, but we don't know. What we did know was that the people who had traveled with former President Trump to the debate didn't wear masks, okay, which were required, and did not put them on. And that was something that I think everybody who was in the Biden part of the audience felt very strongly about. We had been a very careful campaign, and they they came in and they didn't have masks on. They didn't wear masks. I think that raised significant issues for us. both in terms of our vice presidential debate and the subsequent two debates, even before we found out that Trump had COVID. Okay, and whether or not he had it there were obviously people who traveled with him who were diagnosed the next day. So, or tested positive the next day. So I would say that the cascading effect of all of this was, had a huge impact on the next three debates. So.
Yeah, the other thing we know on the first debate is actually the President Trump's behavior cost him quite a bit. And that was the dominant takeaway from that debate, was the president who was out of control. And I think really, dug the hole a little bit deeper for himself. That's really what my memory of that debate is.
Yep.
And it was I think it was stunning for the country to see it. It was stunning for the world to see it. And it played into the worst fears and the deepest doubts that the country had about Donald Trump.
You all obviously prepared for that debate. How did what you saw on the stage before that first debate compare to what you prepared for? And can you take us a little bit into those prep sessions and maybe the early aftermath? And Steve, this would be good for you to chime in. The early aftermath of that first debate, sort of what the collective response was. We'd love to get a little insight.
Sure, and I apologize for parachuting back in here in this way, and I might be missing some of the flow of what just preceded me, but I'll say this: both Ron and Bob and Anita, Mike, I'm looking around at our team. Kate's here. The folks who were Jen, there you are. I see you. Everybody who was in our debate. I see Simone, Cedric's there. Everybody was doing some piece of our debate prep. As you can imagine, to do it well and thoroughly, you have to imagine anything that you could possibly imagine and then practice it one time and go through it. And with President Trump in particular, almost anything that you could possibly imagine is a plausible thing that you might see. And so I think it was extraordinary work to be prepared. I thought the president, at the time the vice president, former vice president, did an extraordinary job under really, well, certainly unprecedented circumstances and, almost verbal assault at the time to still keep his cool, remain calm, and still deliver his argument, his vision for the country in a way that I think by the day after, 2 days after, as Mike said, I think the race was again shaped in a way that advantaged us. That really, I think he got a lot of credit just for going through that and coming out the other end with his dignity intact.
Yeah, it sort of felt like a 90-minute encapsulation of the chaos of the Trump presidency, all on one tight stage for people to see. It really, I think it's hard to underestimate how much that performance was unnerving to people. And then by contrast, what Steve was just saying, how much President Biden's ability to withstand it and to overcome it, reinforce for people that he had the right temperament and sort of foundational temperament, I guess, to be president. So I would certainly agree with Mike that that debate was a huge that was a huge moment in the campaign.
Yeah, I want to go back.
Bob did a, the practicing, the anticipating questions, the work that everybody did was really extraordinary. And obviously one of the kind of big unsung, successes of this campaign was how well prepared and how much work went into it with really that team of folks that Ron led around the debate, Ron and Anita, and that Bob and Mike and our comms folks all prepared him for to do. And that just was really strong work. And more than anything, the president delivered under extraordinary circumstances.
Bob
These are
played
critical
an
moments, right?
excellent Trump. I will just say, Bob did yeoman's work here, just truly amazing.
Can you paint us a quick picture of like the scene that you're envisioning right now in your mind? It's flashing before your eyes. The Bob vignette.
No, but I will say, as
Bob
I will say, as
done
someone who was
Bernie
involved in, no, but I'll say as someone who not only was involved in debate prep, but is Bob's wife, that one of the things that was clear once he started serious prep, and was watching all of those Trump rallies, which, you know, most of us didn't watch in total. You'd see like the crazy thing Trump had said the night before, but once he started watching them in full, those speeches, and we were watching them, that the idea that the people of the United States were going to see that kind of stuff in a debate and feel good about their president. I mean, it really crystallized that most people in this country didn't watch those things and didn't know what like 90 minutes of Donald Trump sounded like. And granted, Trump, whether or not he was sick, brought his Trumpiest most performance to that debate, his most out of control performance. But I would just say that I think that a huge part of it really was the fact that most people in this country didn't have that sort of exposure to just unfiltered Trump for 90 minutes, the way they did that night.
Yeah, Bob did a hell of a job doing Senator Sanders at an earlier stage in our debate preparations, and to see him kind of transform into from Senator Sanders into President Trump was an extraordinary thing to watch too. It was quite a job.
Bob, if we have some time left at the end, we'd love to give you the opportunity to riff for us a little bit. I want to go back to COVID quickly. All right, so Trump gets COVID. You know, I remember in the 2016 campaign, there was a lot of debate inside Clinton world about like, should they focus more on going after Trump and, you know, the women and whatever, the bankruptcy, or should they focus more on making an affirmative case for themselves on economic issues and talking to economically displaced voters in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan? So take us to this point now in your general election campaign. President Trump has COVID. How is that a turning point in terms of your messaging? Was COVID always the main subject? Is it the main subject now? Were you afraid that Joe Biden would get COVID? Were you afraid that COVID would actually help Trump get reelected? How did Trump getting it himself crystallize COVID as like the salient issue for the remaining weeks of the campaign?
So I'll start, and then Mike and others can jump in. I remember so clearly the first thing that the president said when we found out about Trump was, I hope he's okay, because he's the president of the United States and we need him to be okay. So, you know, that was really something that, again, just a reminder of him knowing what was at stake and how bad that would be for the country. And that was his first instinct. You know, I don't think we needed Donald Trump to get COVID for COVID to have been one of the main drivers of what we were talking about and leading the campaign, because everyone in this country were gripped with that. But the COVID was in tandem with the economy and what was happening. And frankly, you know, I think for us, we really felt like, you know, again, this kind of goes to not being distracted. You know, ultimately, Donald Trump wasn't doing his job. He was not taking care of the American people. He was not helping them through this pandemic. He was not holding the economy together. You know, there was nothing that he was doing in leading, whether he had COVID or not. And that's really what we were focused on, and we stayed focused on. Having him, you know, get COVID, obviously we were unsure how he would respond to it, but our money was on the same way he's responded to every other thing that he's dealt with. And so we felt like we needed to make sure that we continued our path. We made it very, very clear, you know, that Joe Biden was going to lead us through this, that we had a crisis, and that he was the only person that could do that. And this was just another example of it. I will say, when it comes to COVID at large, I mean, normally you're worried about winning or losing. We were all worried about how to ensure everyone is safe. And it wasn't just the the president. It was the people that were at the debate. It was the people every day that were traveling. It was the people that would be at events. So, you know, to say that we took COVID seriously is a huge understatement, because we had to ensure that people were safe. And we, you know, again, just back to, you know, some of what we talked about earlier this morning, the president made clear over and over again that safety had to come first, that we had to be a role model here. You know, in addition to hearing that Trump had COVID, he was also incredibly worried about the people we had in the audience. To Anita's point, they weren't wearing masks. They were not, you know, they were in a position where everyone was like, we went through contact tracing, how close we were to teams, all that stuff. That became a whole massive department of our campaign that we dealt with every single day to make sure that every part of how we functioned was, you know, safe across the board. So it really, from an operational standpoint, had real impact across the board. But from a message standpoint, and nobody could talk better to this than Mike, it was always the tip of the spear, because it's what the American people cared about. And he was clearly the leader that could get us through it, and Trump wasn't.
I mean, the COVID issue was, you know, dominant from March, April on. And, you know, when Trump got COVID, it presented him an opportunity that he didn't take, right? He could have reversed field, he didn't do it. As Jen was saying, one of the things about the COVID issue was it put Joe Biden in an unusual position for a challenger, meaning the country was living through a crisis relative to its public health as well as its economic, you know, the country shutting down economically. And they saw a president in action and failing to deal with the dominant crisis in the country. And they actually looked to Joe Biden as actually kind of like a shadow president. And they looked at how he was addressing the issue, how he multiple occasions talked about what he would do if he was president. And they looked to him and they said, you know what? We'd be better off if he was president. He has a better answer. And it was an unusual sort of circumstance where a country looks to the sitting president and they're looking to that person to lead them through a crisis. And they watch a president that's failing to do that. At the same time, they're looking at a challenger who's actually putting forward a more specific and clear path forward for the country. And one of the things that we did through the course of the campaign, it was true relative to COVID, was also true more generally, was early on, one of the decisions we made in the campaign was that a critical component of Joe Biden being elected president was that his favorability rating was going to have to remain in pretty good shape. And so we made a commitment early on.
Like how high? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but what is pretty good shape?
I would say somewhere, you know, high 40s, low 50s. I mean, the truth was Joe Biden ended this campaign with a higher favorability rating than he started it. Okay? That's after, you know, some 20 people in a primary and Trump for a whole year or more. But the point is that it was critical for him to stay in a positive sort of dimension on the personal favorability rating, you know, because it gave a permission structure for people to move towards him. I mean, one of the things that had hurt, you know, in 2016, the country was in a place where both the choices they had on their personal favorability ratings were in really tough shape. You know, and so one of the things that happened in 2016 was I think there was something in the range of 18% of the country actually didn't like either candidate. And those people voted, I think, broke pretty decisively for Trump. In this election, I think fewer than 3% of the country had a negative opinion of both candidates. But the point is that, look, Trump started this election. Right? He wasn't really running on his record. He was running to destroy Joe Biden. And we had to put in place a structure to prevent that from happening. And one of the things we did was we made a huge investment in 60-second ads for a long period of time. There was always a 60-second ad on the air. A lot of it was the vice president speaking in his own words. We ran very few exclusively negative campaign TV ads. We ran a fair bit of comparative and we ran a lot of positive. But that was all directed at putting of keeping Joe Biden in place to win. And it was one of the decisions that I think made sense. You know, we'll never know. Obviously, we don't know the alternative universe. But I think it was probably a good decision, especially given the amount of attacks that were leveled and the choice that Trump really made in terms of how he was running.
I want to pick up on that specifically with the former president really trying to drag down Biden's numbers, trying to really go negative, specifically on a couple of different issues. One of them, obviously, the Trump campaign made a very public display of trying to bring up Biden's age, the fact that he would be the oldest president. They said, they hinted, and in some cases said just outright that he was suffering from dementia. They talked about him being in the basement. They even talked about, his stutters, or any time that he had a gaffe or didn't say the words the way he wanted to. The Trump campaign jumped on it, clipped those videos and put them out to the world. I wonder how your campaign, specifically maybe from a comms perspective for Kate and Simone, how your campaign dealt with that approach by the Trump folks to brand Biden as unfavorable because he was old, and then obviously you had the stuff about Hunter that came out as another topic that I think we can talk about quickly. But the Trump folks really wanted to drag down his numbers, and they focused on some areas that they saw as vulnerabilities for the now president.
Yeah, I think there were sort of two things here. I mean, one on the the age question. I mean, and the attempts to sort of to paint him as not being sharp. I mean, first and foremost, I think the most effective thing we had going for us is people had a sense of him. They trusted him. They knew him. He was well defined for them. He had been vice president, and they saw him. They had a sense of who he was and his character, and so I think we really leaned hard into not shying away from calling out when they would make these sorts of attacks, putting forward video and clips, and obviously it was easier to do during the primary when we were out in the world. It was a little harder during the general when we were in COVID lockdown, but we'd be really aggressive about putting forward content that showed him engaging and just on its face kind of obliterated the argument and sort of underscored the absurdity of the argument. So we tried to be really thoughtful and intentional in our comms on that. And that for that particular attack, I think the part of the reason it didn't stick was it was so ludicrous on his face when he was out engaging with people, talking to people, and people had such a great sense of who he was. So we were intentional about that and worked to make sure that we were leading, with him everywhere we could, making sure that we were putting him on camera, that people were seeing him. You mentioned the Hunter stuff. I think we took from the primary onward, we took a very aggressive approach to dealing with those attacks, and made a decision that we were going to take them head on. We were going to be very aggressive with outlets about it. We did a lot of work in the fall, particularly as obviously as Trump's call to the Ukrainian president came out into the world and impeachment started. We were very aggressive with outlets, putting forward, doing calls with senior editorial leadership at outlets, putting forward a memo challenging them not to book Rudy Giuliani, who was lying every moment he was given on television. And so, I think, again, people had a sense of who the now president is. They had a sense of his character, his integrity. They also had a sense of who Trump is and his capacity for lying, frankly. And so I think we benefited from a really aggressive strategy to never accept any one of these attacks, and to be really for it, and not to be afraid of elevate, the kind of the usual calculus you go through when you're thinking about responding to an attack. Are we going to elevate it? Are we going to give it credibility? I think we really erred on the side of being aggressive and forward, and pushing back. And I think that paid dividends over the course of the campaign. But at the end of the day, I think they failed to define him, because he is so well defined, and has is so well known and trusted, and connects with people so effectively, that those sorts of attacks ultimately just did not get traction.
We want to talk about election night and the days after, just because we're mindful of the time and don't want to run out of time without asking about a truly historic series of events. But just very quickly, I want to check the box on this. To what extent I think once you have been a stutterer, you are always someone who stutters and you're just working on not stuttering. Were there moments in the campaign where that came back? It did seem like, and maybe this is a primary election question, not a general election question, it did seem like there were moments where he was so stunned that like his own people were going after him, not you guys, but the competitors, that where he was searching for words. And I'm wondering to what extent he grappled with fending off kind of a stuttering resurgence and how this was a factor in the campaign.
Well, others can weigh in here too. I don't think it was a resurgence. I think he made a choice to be vocal and candid. He did the long sit down with John Hendrickson at the Atlantic, and it was a really, really powerful conversation where he was, he talked about his struggles as a child, overcoming his stutter, and sort of how it had a lasting, impact on him. And I think showing that vulnerability and being candid, that was another way in which he was able to connect with people. That was one of the most shared stories and pieces of content, for lack of a better term, that was generated during the campaign. More people saw that piece and engaged with it than a lot of other, certainly other interviews, earned media that he did. So I think his candor about that was really powerful. I think to sort of tie back to Toluse's question, I think his candor about that also disarmed some of the attempt to paint him as not being able to speak clearly. I think so. I think his willingness to be candid about it was really impactful. I don't think there was a marked difference in how he was speaking on the campaign versus prior to the campaign. But I do think his decision to be candid about that was really powerful and really connected with people.
Joe Biden I just think, I don't know where this question came from, Margaret. I think it's kind of random, but also, if you want to bring it up, Joe Biden was a leader. He talked about bullies and used his own very personal experience as someone who was bullied as a young person to speak to millions of Americans across the country and to point out something that was very clear about the current president, at that time, the current president of the United States, who was in fact a bully. And so I think, if anything, the fact that President Biden was so candid about the fact that he was a stutterer showed his leadership on the issue, if anything else. And the fact that that's the kind of person that he is, it went back to his character and why the American people felt so connected to him and felt like they knew him. The most poignant piece of all of this is the young man in New Hampshire, I believe it was, Braden. I was there in that rope line that day where then candidate Biden met Braden on the rope line, a young boy who came up to him, who was with his father, and talked about the fact that President Biden was a stutterer and he was the vice president of the United States and a candidate was encouraging to him. Then candidate Biden invited Braden back afterwards, had a private conversation with him, kept in touch with him as he does with so many people. So if anything, the fact that Joe Biden was a stutterer is an example, yet another example of how human he is, how much of a leader he is, and just how he has used personal experiences that have really affected him to speak to the American people and help other people. So maybe that's what you were getting at with this question.
It sounds like I very inadvertently hit a sensitive spot, and I know everyone here is protective of President Biden, but I was not aiming to hit a sensitive spot. I was trying to ask a real question, which is that, like, there's no higher stakes than a general election, than a presidential election. And I honestly was wondering whether this was something that he was grappling with or concerned about in that key moment when it mattered the most. But I appreciate all of those answers to that question. Could we go to election night and the days that followed? And Tolu, maybe you want to take the baton from here, but I think we really do want to get to the questions of, as the votes came in and you realized what was going to happen and that Joe Biden was about to become President Biden, how you prepared for the days and the weeks that were about to come.
Yeah, I would love some reaction to specifically election night, because it was very unclear at the moment what was going to happen. You had former President Trump going to the White House saying, frankly, we did win this election, and really beginning to turn the wheels of what became January 6th. So for folks who are in the room with now President Biden, give us a sense of how he was responding to the numbers coming in, to what we were seeing from the White House in terms of trying to lay the groundwork for what became an insurrection, essentially saying that people should not trust what was happening in the ballot boxes across the country.
I'd just start by saying he was prepared and we were prepared, right? I mean, the thing that we were most prepared for was every possible scenario that could come in election night. We knew we were going to win. We knew that it would take longer for this vote to come through. We knew we were not going to have this called in the early days and hours and minutes after polls started closing. And we were very, very vocal about that. And we tried to be as vocal as possible that this was going to be a period where polls would close and that the answer would not be clear, and that Joe Biden was going to win, but we had to wait it out, and that Donald Trump was going to try to do what he was doing. Did we imagine the Fox News, Arizona, like crazy business back and forth there? No, but did we know we were going to win Arizona? Yes, I would have bet basically everything I owned on winning Arizona, because by that point I was so in the tank for Arizona, I had no other choice but to do it. So I think we were like heavily prepared. He was heavily prepared, and we really tried through all the megaphones that we had to really signal that and go out there very clearly about the scenarios. And then to also make sure that we were very conscious that we couldn't wait for this to just be determined before we started speaking. So, keeping him updated, but then, determining that we felt very confident where we were. It was going to take time. He had to go address the American people and speak to that. That was very, very important to him. It was very important, I think, for folks to hear and really, I think, grounding and to know that we're going to get there. And we really felt like, from that point, we had to keep talking to people. So we had the Jen and Bob Roadshow a little bit to say, like, incredibly transparently. And I think, it happened. So now we're like talking about it, but it actually isn't very normal that you would go out and you would say, okay, here's exactly where we are. Here's exactly what's outstanding by our numbers. Here's what we think is, going to come in this pocket. I remember saying, like, North Carolina in particular, a state we obviously had hoped to win. We played heavily in, but we knew based on the numbers that we weren't going to get it. So in one of those early sessions in the early hours and the next day, we were saying that was leaning towards Trump. That wasn't there. And here's where we were in these other states. So we felt like we had to just open everything up, tell people exactly what we knew, made sure that they understood the path here and that they stayed calm with us for our folks, but also for the good of what, the country. We thought that was really important, but I think there was nothing more important than the president's voice and him being able to communicate out there and reassure people and be clear. I think that was, the perfect counterweight to what we're hearing in some pretty crazy times. I don't know, Bob, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I think it was extremely important that we were out there. I will say, by the way, just to give you one anecdote, when Trump came out and said this election is being stolen from, it was 2:00 in the morning, if I recall, or close between 2 and 2:30 in the morning, at which point that his inner circle knew that he'd lost the election. Yeah. I mean, that was just clear. So but we did feel, and Jen is absolutely correct, that it was really important to reassure people, to cut through the fog, to cut through the lies, which were only going to thicken and become more dangerous in the weeks ahead. So I think that was a pivotal decision. I agree with Jen about that.
Obviously, go ahead, Margaret.
I was going to say, when did you actually think that it would be over?
So I would say when I knew for sure we absolutely had it, we knew on election night, we talked about it, but like when I saw the data that I knew we had, it was about 4 a.m. on Wednesday, where we had done, we every 2 hours, 1 hour, 30 minutes, sort of dependent, we were going through the numbers. And we really, we had intel from the ground. We had our own data. Our data was incredibly strong. As I had said earlier, we were much tighter and closer to the results than the public data. We had gone through so many different scenarios of what would happen as things adjusted. And that morning call, we knew we had it, and we knew it was just going to take time to move through it. I think that, we were very close working with elected officials, hearing what was happening on the ground, monitoring the counts. We had all these massive voter protection teams that were giving us readouts. And so it then just became a matter of how quickly can they go through it? What is the sequencing? Obviously every state, but every county counts differently. That was another big thing that we spent a lot of time communicating about, not just, here's what we expect out of this county, but they're going to count their early votes first. And then next they're going to get their overseas ballots. And then the third step is that, and then frankly, acknowledging that these election workers are volunteers and they were doing the count day after day. So I think we thought once we got into Wednesday that it would still take a couple days because of what we're seeing, how tight it was in these states, and just the practical process of finalizing the votes, that we were going to need the full, the full package of votes. We weren't going to be able to make some assessments until we were totally done there.
I think we are running a little short on time, but I do want to get to January 6th. Normally these kinds of discussions end pretty quickly after Election Day, but obviously last year and the beginning of this year have been extraordinary. So looking at the final tally, Trump got 74 million plus votes, significantly less than what Biden got, but more than he got in 2016, and a large amount. And a good chunk of those voters believed what he was saying about the election in terms of calling it rigged and stolen and whatnot. And a subset of those people stormed the Capitol on January 6th, as we all saw. I wonder if you can take us inside the campaign and take us inside your own heads about sort of what you were thinking as that was unfolding, and what you thought it meant for the incoming administration, which was going to be sworn in just 2 weeks later. And I can just throw that to the broad group.
Right, but I would actually suggest, Bob, you want to address just briefly the planning that we had done for January 6th legally. So
we had, as I know has been reported elsewhere, we had not just lawyers all over the country who were helping with basic voter protection. We literally had a core of hundreds of lawyers who prepared papers, templates, memos, model pleadings for every, I think Jen said this earlier, every conceivable outcome. And so January 6th was actually on our radar screen, but primarily because of the objections procedure and also the question of how Pence would respond to Donald Trump's insistence that he send the vote back to the states. And so we had a detailed planning around what Pence could conceivably do that ultimately he didn't do. And all of us had different views of whether he would do it or not, but nonetheless, we had to plan for it. I cannot say that we planned for what we actually saw on television, but I'd just say two things about that. The first is that questions of security did come up in our conversations with the congressional leadership staffs, and they had been assured that it's not that they hadn't thought about it because everybody knew about the rally, but they'd been assured that security arrangements had been made and they were comfortable with what they were told because that's what they were told. So I would just mention that it's not that nobody thought something could happen, it's just that they thought they were protected against it. That's the first point. The second point was a significant concern to us was just that when the proceedings were suspended, and of course safety was guaranteed for the congressional leadership and for the vice president, the question was, would the president and his team have succeeded in doing what they wanted to do, which was to disrupt the count, to take it beyond January 6th? And many of you recall that Giuliani was reported to have been calling around to people saying, do whatever you possibly can do to stop this from happening. We don't want this count to be completed. And for the Senate to declare formally that the tally favored definitively, finally, as reported by the Electoral College, Joe Biden. And so we were in touch with people in the Capitol, and it became very clear, in a way that's, by the way, not reflected in the partisan divisions around this point that you've heard since, that the Democrats and Republicans were unified. I mean, yes, I'm sure there were outliers, and we didn't talk to Ted Cruz, we didn't talk to Josh Hawley, but it was very clear that the leadership was unified in the view that this was not going to happen, that they were not, whether they had to bring members back at 3:30 in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, 5:15 in the morning, as soon as they could be safely reassembled, they would be reassembled. And that was very much our focus, because we had to bring the formal electoral process to a conclusion.
Was part of did the contingency planning involve what to do if he just wouldn't go? And what did that contingency planning look like?
So to go again to the point that, and Jen said this at the very outset, that we had to plan for everything. We also had to keep our heads, and we planned for things and developed detailed contingency efforts, legal efforts, for outcomes that we thought extremely unlikely. And I was never concerned that he would just sort of sit in the White House and say, I'm not leaving. For a variety of reasons, we were confident that couldn't happen, even if in fact that's what he intended to do somehow in some way. So I was not worried that we couldn't get him out. I thought once we had to get through the process, we had to get through the ascertainment process, we had to get through the Electoral College vote, we had to get past the deadlines for state legislatures to create problems for us with alternative slates being sent to Washington. Then we had to get past the entire set of the procedures on January 6th. Once that was done, you know, had he tried some other maneuver, and we thought about various ways he might do it, to say, well, I actually don't have to leave because I'm the elected president, in the same way we recently heard that he thought he might be reinstated as president in August under the heretofore unknown reinstatement clause of the United States Constitution. There was really no chance that was going to happen. So, you know, I wasn't terribly worried about that. I don't think anybody was terribly worried about it, but yes, we did have plans.
We literally have just like one more minute before we're going to give it over to students, but I wanted to sneak in just one last question, just kind of broadly, about whether or not after all of the drama, after the long campaign, after the insurrection, if there was a moment, and maybe it was before, maybe it was during the transition period before January 6th, whether there was a moment where, as a campaign collectively, you all took a sigh of relief and essentially had the "we did it, Joe" moment that the vice president had on camera. Whether the campaign had that, and anyone can take it, and then we'll kick it over to our students to ask some final questions.
The Saturday that, oh, I'm sorry, Steve, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the night that the networks called it, that day that the networks called it, I think we all were so overwhelmed and full of emotion that day and into that evening. That was one of the great experiences of my life.
And I apologize because Bob and I have to leave, unfortunately. So thank you so much for having us.
Anita, Bob, thank you.
Thank you.
With that, why don't we bring forth our Harvard College student, Lap, who will ask our first question. Lap?
Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I guess my question is that we saw a drastic shift away from the Democratic Party from specific minority groups, such as the Vietnamese community in Orange County, which shifted about 40 points from 2016, and Hispanics in Miami-Dade, which the county shifted 22 points from 2016. And so part of this was what Julie called kind of a disinformation campaign by the Trump campaign, painting Democrats as socialists. But fueling the fire was also the formation of this Biden and Sanders unity task force. So upon reflection, what do you believe were the gaps in the campaign's messaging to counter this portrayal of Biden as a socialist, the effects of the Biden-Sanders unity task force, and what would you have changed messaging towards minority groups fearful of socialism if you could redo the election again?
I'll start. There's a lot there. Folks should jump in. Look, I think that disinformation is a huge issue in our country, I mean, globally. And, you know, I think one of the biggest challenges that we continue to have is the platforms that move disinformation and misinformation are not platforms that we have effectively been able to prevent that from happening in a way that, you know, is sufficient. You know, it is well known now how much we tried to push and fight with Facebook as we saw this. And it wasn't just about disinformation, you know, about the president, but about the election, now about vaccines. So we have a much more systemic issue here. But it's also that you weren't able to see who was getting it and how. And, you know, one of the things that we actually did for the first time ever as a campaign was really try to build some arsenal to figure out what messages were having the most impact, because we couldn't stop all of them, but we couldn't see all of them. So the ones that we were able to reach, who are they going to, and what was that actual impact? So we were trying to get to the core of that, and then find other people that were similar to the folks we saw the greatest impact and try to get to them ahead of time so that we were pre-programming and communicating to them before this disinformation was coming, because we couldn't stop it. I think that, you know, frankly, every campaign has a lot that we can do more of. I think not being able to organize in some of the traditional ways in particular was hard for us to reach different communities. And that this is no different. I think that South Florida honestly takes on greater mystique here of 2020 that I actually think is a bit more of an anomaly than other places. And I think the disinformation, I think certainly the socialism piece, but, you know, let's not forget, Donald Trump put a lot of time and effort into reaching different core voters, and they work for it in a way I think we talked about earlier that, you know, other candidates haven't. And so I think that some of this was a bit of a perfect storm. I think the disinformation piece is significantly problematic. It is going to continue to be problematic. And I don't think we are built as a country and as a system and as a political element on our campaign, across the parties, across the movement, to stop that. And we unfortunately don't have the control to do it. So I think that's something that we really have to solve for moving forward for all of us, and for how people engage in information and disinformation and live their lives.
Thank you, Jen. All right, our final question from Harvard College student Desiree. Desiree.
On the floor today is that awesome. Thank you so much, first of all, for being here today. It's really awesome, I think, just as a student to be able to speak with you and to have our questions answered, because, you know, we are very curious individuals. I guess this was touched on a little bit earlier, but I just want to know, so the pandemic has had obviously a profound effect on a lot of groups of individuals during the election. And I think, as myself as a student, from the experience I can speak best on, this was like just a large impact on a very influential time of our lives, obviously, in which we are starting school, you know, we're still getting our education, like our lives haven't really began yet. So I just want to know, how specifically do you think your campaign kind of addressed this concern among students in the US, and maybe even influenced how we might vote in the future?
Simone, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think young people were an important part of our campaign throughout the duration, from the primary throughout the general, and specifically important to then candidate Biden, because he got into politics as a young person, ran for county council. When he was elected senator to the United States Senate, he wasn't even old enough to be sworn in. He readily tells a story. And I think in organizing specifically young people this election cycle, we broke it up into many different sectors. Oftentimes people talk about the youth vote. I think youth is the size on a t-shirt. We're talking about young leaders, young organizers, and young people are, yes, college students. So we had a robust Students for Biden program. We had a high schoolers for Biden program that really targeted young people who were maybe not 18 yet early in the cycle, but by the time election day came, they were able to vote, and created communities where they could talk about their experiences, where they organized online campaign drives, but also where we heard them. They got to hear from us as campaign officials. They heard directly from Dr. Biden, the president and candidate Biden. They heard from then Senator Harris. They heard from Mr. Imhoff, and really were an important part and fabric of our campaign. In places across the country, we had robust student organizing in their campuses online. We won those districts in places like Chicago, and in our turnout in Michigan was very strong among student populations. And I think that this election cycle will be remembered for all of us. It is not lost on the president and the vice president that young people went through this election cycle, went through their senior years, missed seeing their friends on campuses. And so when Joe Biden talks about restoring the soul of this nation, rebuilding the backbone of this country, uniting America, young people are a core piece of that. And I think folks felt that throughout this campaign.
Thank you, Simone, and thanks to the entire Biden team for you've been generous with your time and candid with your responses. We are very grateful to our student questioners and to Aristotle and Desiree and Michael Pack, who assisted us with the preparation for this, our 5 moderators who expertly navigated this, and Toluse and Margaret, thank you especially for this session. This is an important part of our whole process. We are committed to this since 1972. We will be publishing the book, and we look forward to getting more information to you about it. And finally, my thanks to my colleague, Christian Flynn, who since 2000 has been a part of these quadrennial convenings. He takes it very seriously. He's poured his heart into this. And we're very, very grateful to him. So we will end there with our thanks, especially for your own public service, commitment to this administration. It's the mission of the Institute of Politics is to inspire Harvard students to public service and politics. And we thank you for the example that you set for our students. Good luck with everything, and thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.